All right, so as Jesus continued in his message, commonly called the Sermon on the Mount, I want you to remember, to remind you of some important facts here. One, that Jesus spoke to a Jewish audience. That's probably the most important fact, where that also ties in with the fact that he was under the Mosaic Law. While this is Matthew, and that page in front of Matthew 1 says the New Testament, this is not the New Testament. The New Testament or the New Covenant doesn't begin until Jesus' death on the cross. And so we're still under the law. Jesus lived his entire life under the law. And I know this might disturb a number of Christians. This message was not for you. You weren't there. It was not written to you. Now, we can get benefit from it by reading it and studying it, but the bottom line is it wasn't written to us. It was written to Jews under the Mosaic Law. And the fact is that Jesus fulfilled the Old Covenant Mosaic Law. That's one of the things that he came to do. And New Covenant believers are not under the Old Covenant. We're under the New Covenant. Jesus' message was an attempt to convince the Jews in his day that they could not achieve righteousness by their attempts at keeping the Mosaic Law. By the way, that's still true. There's nothing that you and I can do that is going to give us righteousness or maintain righteousness. That is something that God must do for us. But Jesus was trying to convince them that their attempts at keeping the law were not making them right with God. No one was ever made right by their attempts to keep the law. The law never did that. It never accomplished that. Righteousness has always been given, not worked for. Even in the Old Testament under the Mosaic Law, the way that they were saved, if you want to use that word, was by faith, not works. It's never been by works. That's still true to this very day. It's not by works. It's what Jesus did on the cross and then rose from the dead. This new covenant that we are under. The Mosaic Law was very good at condemning everyone who failed to keep it. And by the way, when it comes to keeping the Mosaic Law, it wasn't just the 10 Commandments. It was 613 rules that were given under the Mosaic Law. And they were required to keep them. And the reality is no one ever did. So the law condemned them. But they thought by keeping certain portions of it, they were okay with God. The truth was that they were not. And Jesus was attempting to get them to believe that they needed something more than law keeping in order to be made right with God. The Mosaic Law does not save anyone. It has never saved anyone. It's always been faith in God. And so again, Christians today need to understand that they cannot achieve righteousness nor maintain righteousness by anything that they have done, including law keeping, if that's what they're attempting to do. The good news is that Jesus solved the sin problem on the cross. When John the Baptist said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," he really meant it. That's what Jesus did on the cross. He solved the sin problem. He died on that cross. He rose from the dead so that we can be forgiven by the cross, but we can have life, spiritual life, through Jesus Christ, through faith in Jesus Christ. That's the message that he wanted them to understand. It wasn't law keeping. They just didn't get it. In Jesus' sermon, he wanted the listeners to realize that their problem was internal. It wasn't about their failure to keep external laws. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. But we need to understand, Jesus is focusing on the Mosaic Law. In the verses that we're going to look at today, Jesus referred to the Mosaic Law and that Jews were taught these things about the Mosaic Law. In verses 21 and 27, he said, "You have heard." In verse 31, he said, "It was said." Each phrase in those verses was a direct reference to the Mosaic Law. the law that they were all under. And Jesus is reminding them of what the law taught and what they had heard about the law. Because quite frankly, as we'll see in a little bit, it was not just the Mosaic Law they were trying to keep, but all the additional rules and regulations that the religious leaders added to the law that they were supposed to be able to keep. Every Jew present that day knew what Jesus was talking about when he said, "You have heard," or when he said, "It was said." They knew that Jesus was referring to the Mosaic Law because they were under the law. And he had already told them earlier in Matthew's Gospel that he did not come to abolish the law. That's back in verse 17. Jesus told them that he was going to fulfill the law. He was going to keep it perfectly. And he also told them that their righteousness needed to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders. Because they looked to the religious leaders and was like, "Oh, they're so righteous with God. Look at how they keep the law." And they weren't getting it, because it wasn't about law keeping. The fact is, even the scribes and the Pharisees were failing at keeping all 613. They thought they'd arrive, and Jesus says, "Let me just tell you something. Your righteousness must exceed that." Now, those people there that day, you know what they were going was, "What? How can our righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? They're the most righteous people we know." And that's what Jesus wanted them to understand. So Jesus spoke about the Mosaic laws that prohibited certain actions. He's going to give 3 specific ones that he refers to. And then he explained that when they violated these laws, the problem was an internal problem. It began internally, and that's what he wanted them to understand. The external rule did not stop them from violating the law. Let's think about this morning. You all drove to church this morning, and along your drive, there were signs along the road. And what did those signs say? Speed limit. Did that sign prevent you from going beyond the speed limit? Now, I might say, since I only live 3/4 of a mile from here, I was okay. Today. But if I'd been running late, I might have violated the law. You see, the law doesn't prevent you from violating it. It just says this is wrong. And in the Mosaic Law, there was also punishment that went along with violating the law. The Mosaic Law did that. It stipulated the punishment. The Mosaic Law did not solve the internal problem. And that's what Jesus wants them to understand. And so what is he going to do? He's going to begin with something they could all agree on, that murder was wrong. That's the external act. So in verse 21 is where we pick up. "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable in the court.'" Now, who told the ancients about this? Well, Moses did. This is a reference to the Mosaic Law. Moses was the one that gave the Jews the law. And again, specifically in this case, he's referring not to just the law in general, but specifically the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20, verse 1. We have the commandment, "You shall not murder." By the way, it doesn't say "you shall not kill." It says "you shall not murder." It's often misquoted. So if a Jew murdered someone, they would face the court. The court system was established by the Mosaic Law. And in that court system, you had to have someone. You had to have people that would step forth as witnesses to the act. You could not condemn a person without the witnesses. This was all part of the Mosaic Law. A Jew murdered someone, and there was a court to face. And so we read in verse 22, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court." And he continues, "Whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." That sounds pretty serious. Now, I want to point out, Jesus addressed the root cause of murder, which was an internal problem that the Mosaic Law could not fix. Even in our society, we have rules against murder. Does that prevent anybody from murdering someone else? No, it doesn't. And where does the problem start? Long before somebody shoots someone and kills them, they've thought about it. They maybe have planned it. They maybe wanted it. Maybe they hated that person. Maybe they spoke evil about that person, and finally it escalates when they murder them. And that's what I want to show you here about what Jesus is focusing on. Jesus referred to the Supreme Court here. And I want to point this out. The Supreme Court, which was literally the Sanhedrin. That was the high court in Israel. And again, this was a message to the Jews. We need to understand that. A message to Jewish people. That's who he's talking to. So what is he trying to teach them? The problem was not with the law. It was not a law problem. It was a heart problem because their efforts to keep the law could not fix the problem. And so Jesus is going to continue on. Therefore, here is what you're supposed to do. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, here's what you're supposed to do. And remember there that your brother has something against you. Leave your offering there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Now, this is what you're supposed to do. But I also want to point out something about the Sanhedrin. Anybody in this country ever appear before the Sanhedrin? Anybody in this world ever appear before the Sanhedrin? So why do Christians think Jesus is talking to them? There is no Sanhedrin. It was a Jewish court established in Israel. And the last time somebody appeared before the Sanhedrin was probably more than 2,000 years ago. The Sanhedrin doesn't exist. So this tells us, or it should tell us, Jesus is addressing Jews under the law. We need to understand that. And so here's the situation. You find yourself presenting your offering at the altar. Where was the altar? We need to understand that for just a second. Jesus referred to the Mosaic Law when he mentioned an offering at the altar. I know in some churches, at the front part of the church, they have this railing that goes across. And what's it called? The altar. We used to have one in this church. And an invitation would be given, and people would, the preacher would say, come up, if God's speaking to your heart, you need to come forward. And sometimes people would come forward, and they would kneel at the altar, and the preacher would go down there, and he would pray with them. Let me tell you something. That thing that churches call the altar is not what Jesus is talking about. Because under the Mosaic Law, in the temple, there was a thing called the altar. And that's where they would come and bring sacrifices. Do not bring animals into this church to sacrifice them. We don't have an altar. We don't want an altar. What a mess it would make on the carpet. It's not what he's talking about. We need to understand that. When he referred to the altar, it is a reference to the Mosaic Law. We don't have an altar. So, before a person presented something to God at the temple, for which the law demanded, they needed to reconcile with the person who had something against them. So before you even make something at the temple, which was legally required, if someone had something against you, what are you supposed to do? You take care of that first. Take care of the internal problem before you try to do anything with the law. If they reconciled with their brother, you know what? If I settle things with someone who's got something against me, then it's not going to escalate to them wanting to kill me or me wanting to kill them. That's what reconciliation does. It's an internal thing. But they were just focused on, I got to make my altar gift. I got to make that sacrifice and then everything's going to be okay. Not likely. So Jesus goes to the source of the problem. They needed to deal with the heart issue before they dealt with matters of external law keeping. There were consequences for not dealing with anger. You know what the New Testament says about anger? Do not go to bed angry at someone. Settle it with them before you go to sleep that night. That's a good principle to employ. Because you get up the next morning and you haven't, if it's your spouse, and you haven't settled that, it's going to be there the next morning and probably worse. Especially if you're like me and you're not a morning person to begin with. Don't talk to me before my coffee. It's not going to be good. Settle it that night. Don't give the devil an opportunity. That's what Paul tells us. Now let's get back into the Old Testament. Settle these things so they don't escalate into possibly murder. So verse 25, he continues. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way. On the way where? On the way to the temple. So that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. So none of what Jesus said in this verse, pay attention, none of what Jesus said in that verse is in the Mosaic Law. But Jesus emphasized the importance of reconciliation with your opponent. You go search into the Old Testament and you find for me where it says anything about first reconcile with them and then come make your offering. It's not there. We're also going to find in these verses that there are other things that Jesus mentions. They're not in the law. Now, we're going to have to explain what was going on, why he did that. Without reconciliation, though, the result might be prison. They're going to incarcerate you for that. So first you need to reconcile. That's better than going to prison. Reconciliation was better than prison and better than unchecked emotions. That could lead to murder. It wasn't just about a rule in the law. Verse 26, he continued. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid the last cent. There's no letting you out early in prisons of that day. That's just not the way that it worked. You're going to stay there until that debt has been paid. Once a person was found guilty, they did not deal with their anger. If it led to that, there was prison. It was non-negotiable. Of course, if it led to murder, it would probably be execution. That's also non-negotiable. Again, Jesus made the point that the Mosaic Law condemned murder, the external act. But the problem that led to murder was an internal problem. So reconcile, get the internal problem taken care of before you go to the law with anything. Jesus did not minimize the law. He pointed out a real problem that the law could not fix. And that's what we need to see. The law dealt with external behavior. But issues that could lead to murder were internal, not external. That's how it began, internally. And that's what Jesus is wanting them to see. The problem isn't all your external actions, even the actions of keeping the law. The problem is internal, and the law can't fix it. That's what he wants them to understand. You're relying on the law to somehow make you right with God. It never will. What it will do is condemn you before God. And that's what Jesus wants them to understand. It is an eternal problem. The Jews believed if they followed the external rules, they would become right with God. They were wrong. By the way, that hasn't changed. Christianity is not about rules and regulations. Christianity is about, don't smoke, don't chew, don't with girls, go with girls who do. It's not about the rules that you do externally. Christianity is about faith in Jesus Christ, believing what He did on that cross to pay for all of our sin, past, present, future, to put our faith in Him and then to receive from Him not just forgiveness, but resurrection life even now. I know there's a resurrection physically coming, But when we put our faith in Jesus Christ, we receive His life. So we become new creations in Christ. So we get a new spiritual heart transplant, so to speak. We get a new spirit, and we get God's Spirit within us. All of these things are internal. Because that's where the problem is. There's people that keep rules and regulations all their lives, and they're not close to God at all. I know Christians that are all focused on rules and regulations. Let me tell you what, some of those Christians have treated me worse than non-Christians. But oh, they got their rules and regulations. But boy, they will stab you in the back in a heartbeat. It's internal. That's where the problem is. And so now he dealt with murder. From here, he's going to go on to the seed of adultery. They were familiar with murder. They were familiar with adultery. And so he continues on in verse 27. You have heard that it was said, Mosaic Law, you shall not commit adultery. 10 Commandments. And so Jesus again referred to the Mosaic Law. This time it's Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. Verse 28, he continues, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her, by the way, that word lust is a strong desire to possess, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. By the way, that statement right there, that's not in the Mosaic Law. It's not there. Find it. You won't. So what is Jesus doing here? Is he adding to the Mosaic Law? Is he changing the Mosaic Law? Well, let's go on. Verse 28, it says, oops, went too far. Yeah, that's it. Again, whoever looks on a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. And again, Jesus' point is this, that external adultery began internally, and the law doesn't fix the problem. It never fixes the problem. It can highlight a problem. It can condemn you when you violate it, but it doesn't fix the problem. Verses 29 and 30, he continued. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out. Any volunteers? The good news is you only have to do that twice. For it is better for you to lose one of your parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. By the way, that would only be done twice, but you would only be able to do it once. Think about that one. Nothing like this is in the Mosaic Law. Oh, thou shalt not commit adultery is there. You find anywhere in that law where it tells you, gouge that eye out. You won't find it. Anywhere in the Mosaic Law where it says, cut your hand off. You won't find it. So what is Jesus doing here? What is he talking about? Nothing like it in the law. The Jews believed inner problems were solved by external methods, law keeping. So if you got a problem, it's some sort of external thing to do. If that is true, and internal problems can be solved with external actions, then Jesus says, so if you really believe that, if you really believe you can solve your internal problems with external actions, then why don't you just gouge your eyes out? If that's what you really believe, because that's really the extent of what they believe. An internal problem is solved externally. If I have a problem with desiring someone and wanting that person that's not my spouse, maybe what you just ought to do is just gouge your eyes out and the problem will go away. Newsflash, that won't solve the problem. That won't solve the problem. If your problem is taking things that don't belong to you, i.e. someone else's wife, then maybe what you need to do, if you believe that's the solution to the problem, what you need to do is just cut that hand off so you never take what doesn't belong to you again. And by the way, there are countries that actually employ that. If you steal, they'll cut your hand off. But that doesn't solve the problem. Jesus' point is he wants them to understand it doesn't solve the problem. Again, this is not in the Mosaic Law. Jesus emphasized that if they believed external solutions solved internal problems, then they should gouge out their eyes or cut off their hands. I mean, that's the logical thought flow if that's what you really believe. The reality is, external solutions did not solve internal problems, and their attempts to externally follow the Mosaic Law did not solve the spiritual problems or make them right with God. External actions have never made anybody right with God, because it's always been about faith, believing God. You can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve sinned. What was the problem? People say, well, they ate the fruit. Oh, let me tell you something. The problem began before they actually took the fruit. The problem began when both of them, Eve then Adam, did not believe what God said. I mean, think about it. The serpent tempts Eve, and by the way, he misquotes what God said. She listens to that. She thinks that it's good to eat, so she goes ahead. She takes the fruit, and by the way, it doesn't say it was an apple. She bites of it. Where was Adam? Right there with her, because it specifically says who was with her. What did Adam do? Nothing. Now you got to think about this. God said you eat the fruit, you die. He looks at his wife. She took a bite. She's still there. She's still breathing. I have to think in Adam's mind he was thinking, doesn't look that bad to me. But he already had not believed God. That was the problem. They didn't believe what God said. And that problem exists to this very day. In Jesus' day, the problem was they didn't believe Jesus. They didn't believe what God was saying. They didn't believe the prophets. They didn't believe what Moses said, that another would come like him and they should believe him. And today it's the same thing. People don't believe what God says. And they want to make it complicated by adding rules and regulations, but it doesn't fix the problem. It is just simply fixed by faith in Jesus Christ. It's that simple. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it still is. Preachers today, they want to make this a topic about getting serious about sin. What Jesus was teaching here, he's not really telling you to gouge your eyes out or cut off your hand. He's saying what you really need to do is you really need to be serious about sin. Well, first of all, that wasn't Jesus' point. And second of all, it doesn't matter how radically you approach sin. External actions are not going to solve the problem of sin. Only faith in Jesus Christ is going to solve that sin problem, and he already took care of the problem. And Jesus paid that price on the cross. The only solution is not to eliminate the temptation, because it's not going away. Temptation is not going away. Jesus is the only solution. Temptation's still going to be there. You're still going to have sin dwelling within you. The solution is Jesus. He takes care of the sin problem. And he gives you life on top of that. That's the blessing. That is the good news. And it was God's plan to do this. Yes, we will eventually be free from the presence of sin around us and within us, with glorified bodies on top of that. That's down the road when the resurrection, the physical resurrection, takes place. So the topic of adultery naturally led to the topic of divorce. I mean, it's just kind of goes right along with it. What's the seed of divorce? Well, verse 31, he says, it was said, reference back to the law, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now, this one was a reference to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. I encourage you to go back and read that, because many people have a lot of twisted ideas about what that is actually saying. Misunderstandings. So, verse 32, he continues. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Whoa. The Jewish leaders expanded the Mosaic Law to allow for divorce for reasons other than what Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 says, indecency. They expanded it. Ladies, you think you got it bad? You don't want to live in that day. I mean, literally, they could divorce you because you burned the meal. For any reason, you can get divorced. And the reality is, when you were divorced in that society, you didn't have anywhere to go. You didn't have a job outside the home that you could support yourself with. You didn't have laws that were going to give you alimony. You're out. And now you got to somehow survive by yourself. It was a different society than what we have today. Their additions to the law, however, did not solve the internal problem of what caused divorce. The religious leaders knew a divorced woman would seek remarriage. Because what else could she do? She had to survive. So that was one of the things that they would do. And so what Jesus says is, by your new rule, you're forcing her into adultery. Because she doesn't have an alternative. What recourse did she have to provide for herself in Jewish society? And the answer is just about none. Unless maybe she had a family to go back to. Rather than solve the problem, their rules that they added to the law actually made the problem worse. They did not solve it. God did allow divorce because of internal spiritual problems. Their expansion of the law did not solve those spiritual problems. All of their rule following did not make them righteous. And some of their rules made them more unrighteous in God's eyes. Because again, the only way that you can become righteous is if God provides that righteousness for you. And that comes through faith. Because God provided the only solution. And He just wants you to believe it and receive Christ. That's what He wants. Jesus wanted them to understand, again, that external solutions did not solve internal problems. The seeds of divorce were internal, and external solutions did not solve the problem. The solution wasn't the Mosaic Law, because it could not make them right with God. Only faith in God makes you right with God. And I want to explain as well, Jesus didn't expand the law. The law was settled and could not be added to or subtracted from. Remember, Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law. He also did not come to add to the law. This wasn't 614 and 615. No. Jesus was not adding to the law at all. Jesus, even though He was God, did not have authority to change what was given to the Jewish people. It was settled covenant. 613 laws settled, agreed to with the Jewish people, with God, with the Jewish people. It wasn't 612. It wasn't just 10 commandments. It wasn't 620. No, this was established. So Jesus isn't expanding the law. He's wanting them to understand the law can't solve their internal problem. Whether it's murder, whether it's adultery, whether it's divorce, it's an internal issue. And Jesus wants them to understand that. It was a spiritual problem. Jesus pointed out that even radical external actions did not solve internal spiritual problems. This is His message. This is what He wants them to understand. This is still under the Mosaic Law. And He's not expanding it. He's not subtracting from it. He's trying to get them to get the point that law can't fix the problem. Does it mean we do away with law because it can't fix the problem? No. I mean, we would have anarchy in our society if we did away with all laws because they don't fix the problem. Imagine what would happen if we said, well, the murder laws don't stop murder, so let's just do away with the murder laws. Murder would go like crazy. The law restrained, but it didn't fix the problem because the problem was internal. And that's what Jesus wanted them to understand. And by the way, we get a little bit further in here, you're going to see what Jesus says. Be perfect. Uh-oh. That's a real problem for all of us. So Jesus is not expanding, subtracting. He's wanting them to understand that the law never fixed the problems and their focus is in the wrong place.